Democracy, an appeal to popularity.
Okay, new episode of Bad Philosophy with Rock and Mr. E. I'm going to address this right up at the front. Appeal to popularity is a logical fallacy. The logical fallacy is about just because most people believe something, it must be true. That is what the logical fallacy is. Now, democracy is not about that. At least not Republican democracy as we know it, or classical liberalism as we know it. Classical liberalism has rights built in. Locke was a classical liberal thinker. John Stuart Mill, who's a utilitarian, is slightly different, but he's a rule utilitarian, and there are rules. The difference between John Stuart Mill and, say, somebody who believes in rights like Locke or Kant or any of the other philosophers who believe in rights is that Mill believed that a rule only extends to the point where you can show it has good consequences, so you can break that rule whenever it shows that the consequences are not good anymore. So, like, say a rule led to generally good consequences for years and years and years, but then society changed so it would not lead to good consequences, then you can change that rule. I think there are certain rights that are just universal, that everyone should have, and I base them on Kantian rights. Now, if you use this in democracy and you have like a representational democracy, because a direct democracy has so many problems, then I don't think it's appeal to popularity anymore. It ceases to be that. Direct democracy is an appeal to popularity, and it's one of its major problems. But Winston Churchill famously said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others.
In this video, I'm going to deal with two key issues surrounding democracy. The first is the idea that under democracy, anything can be legitimate if people vote for it. And the second is the somewhat common individualist belief that participation in democracy is always illegitimate.
Now, once again, Republican democracy does not say anything can be legitimate just because the people voted for it. This is like the example I used in the social contract model when the courts decided that the people of California voting against gay marriage was unconstitutional. Suddenly you saw right-wingers going, but the will of the people is being violated. No, because that's a violation of rights. So that is not true. It's not true that anything can be valid because the people voted for it. Now, the other concept he's going to be dealing with is libertarian ideas that you shouldn't participate in democracy because libertarians, by principle, are against democracy. So you should not participate in it. The problem with this is, according to social contract theory, you are implicitly consenting to the social contract by participating in your government. That is in social contract theory, which, once again, that gets to that problem. You can't opt out of it. Because, yeah, you have to. He's going to make an argument later, like, yeah, you have to participate in your government, or you can't change it. Which is true. I actually agree with him on that. But it basically shows you, like, a problem with the hardline stance of libertarianism, and, like, really, like, the entire social contract theory that you can't opt out of it, but why would you want to? There's really no reason you would want to opt out of it, unless you just don't value your own freedom, or just don't value your functioning in the society.
Both premises are very important, considering that in the present culture, democracy is widespread, while anything that doesn't involve a democratic process is often considered authoritarian, even if this means a representative democracy where a person votes only once every few years.
I'm not really sure what he's talking about, because the only time I hear it, once again, it's the court system. It's when people, like the court, decides that the democratic process has gotten the wrong answer, and because it violates our constitutional rights. It's usually right-wingers who go upset. It's right-wingers who are talking about activist judges. It's right-wingers. He's always talking about leftists and Marxists and all of this crap, but they usually understand rights better than right-wingers do. But that's because the right wing is really filled with social conservatives who don't give a shit. Most of them would love to have a theocratic government or some other kind of crazy government that wouldn't work. Now, libertarians actually have some philosophical beliefs behind what their policy beliefs are, so they are a little more consistent. But once again, like, I just never hear this on the left. I never hear the left complaining about the fact that democracy is not being held up in violation of somebody's rights. Like, I never hear them complaining about it.
Democracy is an ancient philosophy where casting a vote is not only considered fair, but that the outcome will be preferable in the majority of cases. There are many problems with these assumptions, and several philosophers in the past have tried to argue for or against democracy. In ancient Greece, Plato hated democracy, considering the masses to be incapable of doing what's best. He thus believed in a benevolent dictatorship where philosopher kings would rule, sacrificing happiness, love, offspring, wealth, and all the trappings of individual success to be totally devoted to an impartial role ruling society. By not having any personal gratification, Plato believed the philosopher kings would be incapable of becoming corrupted by power. In Plato's book, The Republic, he describes the process that leads to the deterioration of society through 5 stages, democracy being the 4th stage just before tyranny. He believed that democracy would lead to tyranny because the lower classes would destroy society as they gained more power through voting, leading to a breakdown of law and order.
Now, Plato's reason for disliking democracy is rather obvious. It's because it was democracy that put Socrates, his mentor, to death. It was the Senate that decided Socrates should die for corrupting the young. But in Plato's time, democracy was, first of all, direct democracy, but it was very narrow who could vote. Women couldn't vote, only men. And in Plato's Republic, he actually does take into account, like, he tries to extend women's roles in society while at the same time still being completely sexist about how he viewed women. But at the same time, he thought, yeah, women should have a role in society other than to just be baby makers, which was kind of progressive of him of the time. So Plato, it's very complex, Plato's kind of views on government, but he basically, a lot of people have characterized Plato's government as a fascist government. It's very anti-democracy. It's very authoritarian. The entire idea is based on the noble lie, where you lie to the people in order to get them to accept things that you think are good for them. And the philosopher kings are supposed to be, as he said, completely free from being influenced because they give up basically wealth and having children and like basically all the earthly things that would make them biased. So that's the idea, and the philosopher kings make all the decisions about the government, but basically by lying to people. Now, Plato's Republic is not that dissimilar from what Orwell came up with in 1984. Some philosophers really take it personally if you say Plato's a fascist, that his idea of a state is fascist. And I know he didn't intend for it to be fascist, and just like other philosophers, like, say, Rousseau, he thought that it would just be a small city-state, and if you didn't like it, you could go to another one. But once again, this is his idea of a perfect government. So if they all are, because Rousseau's is democratic and Plato's is authoritarian, then wouldn't all the city-states be like that if they adopted the perfect government?
Genevan Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau had an impression of democracy far more in tune with today's Western climate. He believed in direct democracy, wherein each citizen would vote directly on every issue. To counteract the pessimism of the likes of Plato, Rousseau felt that a highly educated citizenry would prevent any corruption from ensuing. In stark contrast to Plato's democratic pessimism, Rousseau was an idealist who believed people could make decisions that worked for the benefit of everyone through a social contract everyone was bound by.
I basically did Rousseau in the last video. Once again, he doesn't mention the general will, and there's a sovereign in Rousseau's philosophy. There are officials who interpret the general will. So that's not really the fallacy either. That's not really the appeal to popularity fallacy either, but he's going to portray it that way.
Rousseau and Plato are 2 extremes when delving into the question of democracy. On one hand, you have Plato's beliefs that people are generally too irresponsible or even too stupid to be capable of voting rationally, while on the other hand, you have the romantic view of Rousseau where people can act for a greater good and even sacrifice their own happiness in doing so. The problem with both Rousseau and Plato is that they both have a deeply flawed impression of individual rights, which is why neither Plato nor Rousseau, or anyone who does not believe in natural rights, can ever create a system that can lead to prosperity.
I actually agree with him on the idea that without rights, no government will work. Without rights. The difference is, though, his version of natural rights is essentially it's consequentialist. It's weird. It's like Hobbesian. I've been thinking about it since the last video, and it's Hobbesian because he says like a right has to be something that you can obtain naturally, and a right has to be something you take responsibility for, and like he justifies the non-aggression principle through a consequentialist version of it. So it's kind of consequentialist egoism. Very similar to Ayn Rand, kind of similar to Hobbes in some way, which is funny because he's very against Hobbes, and Hobbes is authoritarian. Oh, and one more thing. When it comes to democracy, there is little distinction between how Rockin' Mr. E thinks of democracy and Plato thinks of democracy. Little distinction. They just have totally different solutions.
On several occasions, I've talked about types of liberty, one being negative liberty, the other being positive liberty. Sometimes this is referred to as negative or positive freedom, Marxists and other collectivists being particularly fond of this terminology. Positive liberty is the notion that anything can be justified if it leads to more freedom. Negative liberty is the opposite, given that nothing can be justified if it denies someone their freedom.
I object both to the use of liberty and freedom. I would say negative rights versus positive rights. Negative rights would be things that can't be done to you. You can't be killed, would be an example of a negative right. No one has the right to murder you. Positive rights would be things, though, that you may have the right to, like in social societies like healthcare. The right to vote is also a positive right. They like to say in this country that there's no such thing as positive rights in this country, but the right to vote is a positive right. It's not a negative right. And I object to his characterization that anything can be justified if it increases freedom, because that's not true. It has to be proportionate. It's like kind of similar to concepts like the doctrine of double effect, whereas if we're taking away the autonomy of somebody by taxing them and giving money to people who can't pay taxes because they're too poor, we're not taking or hardly taking anyone's autonomy away. Like the increase in autonomy for the poor people we give the money to is so great compared to the decrease in autonomy we give to the rich person, who like after you start making about $200,000, $300,000 a year in this society, like your autonomy is not increased by being richer. Some people might argue that, but that's my stance on it. You're really not increased by being richer. And in fact, they've done studies where people aren't any more happy after so much money. I think it's actually after like $80,000 a year. No, people's happiness doesn't increase.
Pure democracy, where anything can be legitimized through a majority vote, is a form of positive liberty. No consideration for unalienable or absolute rights is spared if it leads to a vote in favour of one outcome. If the people vote for socialism, for example, then socialism is legitimate. But it's interesting to note that socialists don't tend to agree with this when the people vote for freer markets, which takes us right back to positive liberty, where anything can be justified if it leads to more freedom, even if it means disagreeing with democracy.
Nice straw man, Rockin' Mr. E. Socialists believe in economic rights, so it's the same thing. It's like your rights are being violated because of something that's happening, and democracy is not allowed to do that. Democracy is not allowed to violate rights. So let's say we decided people had a right to health care in this country, which doesn't exist right now. But let's say that was added to the Constitution. Then if people voted to eliminate government health care, then it would be illegitimate, because it would be in the Constitution that you have this right. Now, the Constitution, he's going to talk about the Constitution soon. Once again, I don't think rights are privileges that can be given and taken away. I think that they are justified by reason. They're natural rights. However, he wants to constantly make the argument that they're privileges given by the state in a left-wing idea of rights. It just isn't true. It's just you can't have rights without a state to enforce them. In fact, he's an anarcho-capitalist, so actually you can't have rights in his version either. He's doing consequentialism. And there's plenty of situations where I could kill somebody and get away with it in a non-government society. Plenty of situations. It would be much easier.
Democracy is an inherently fallacious appeal to popularity, since morality cannot be upheld by the act of a vote. Voting in itself has no moral value in its own right. To prove this, we can argue that a vote in favour of murder would not make murder virtuous, given that it involves taking the life of another. For democracy to even have a chance of being virtuous, there must be a strict framework in place. Individualists will always base this framework around natural rights and negative liberty.
Once again, Rock in the Street says he lives in the UK, though sometimes he changes it to he lives in the United States. But people who live in the UK, I know there are a few people who, or have lived in the UK. If in the UK, are you allowed to vote, like just to kill Bob? Let's say like you have a vote, you get it on the ballot. Murder Bob. Is that something you're allowed to vote on? Am I missing something? Is that something that you're allowed to vote on? But wait. Only individualists have rights, right? Only individualists. I thought that the UK was a more socialist country than the United States. I don't understand. Are you all individualists in the UK? Are you socialists? What are you? I don't understand. Mark Mystery says only people like him believe in rights. I don't really understand. Someone's going to have to explain it to me.
This means that all rights cannot be granted or taken and stem from natural ability. People will therefore only have one legitimate choice: positive-sum trade. Instead of attempting to coerce people into complying, they will have to rely on negotiation and trade. This is far more preferable to conflict, because conflict can only ever lead to winners and losers, while trade and negotiation leads to a win-win scenario.
Now, I'm guessing that Rocking Mr. E has never heard of a concept called leverage. When you come into a negotiation, sometimes you have more leverage than the other person, and as such, sometimes you can get a much better deal than them. Sometimes you can think you're getting the better deal, or you weren't, but they got the better deal. That can happen. Now we're going back to John Locke. John Locke, I think, gives us, it's been a long time since I've read Locke, but John Locke gives us an example, I think, of like someone who owns an apple orchard, and they can trade their apples. But because apples spoil, they have a limited amount of time to trade their apples. So Locke makes a distinction between, say, like natural trading in a non-government world and, say, like in a government world where they print money. Because the government prints money. And that makes the trade and commerce unnatural. If Rockin' Mystery was a minarchist, this would be a much bigger problem. But because he's an anarcho-capitalist, I don't know exactly what he believes. Like if he believes that there just should be no state apparatus to the point where they don't even print money. Because he might be one of those anarcho-capitalists who believes in like very small city-states and that they do print money. But if there's any printing of money in his solution, that's a problem because it doesn't correspond with the naturalness of Locke's version. And Locke has the best version for natural rights in that sense. Because money, the printing of money and the exchange of money is by its nature unnatural. It makes it much easier to have monopolies. It makes it much easier to hoard things. It makes it much easier to have a big, huge gap between the poor and the rich. Like the printing of money. If we all just traded everything, if the government didn't print money and we all just traded everything, think about it. Because the stuff we trade, a lot of things we trade would be things that do not have an infinite shelf life.
A constitution, like the one set out in the US after the War of Independence, is a good way to lay out the basis for natural rights and negative liberty. Creating a constitution doesn't mean that rights don't exist without it. At the end of the day, it's only a piece of paper. but it does serve as a reminder of the natural rights we all have as sovereign individuals. Sadly, this isn't good enough for advocates of positive liberty. In the US, this has resulted in insinuations that the Constitution is a living document that can be altered to suit an agenda. This is nothing but a creeping mission to destroy natural rights and push it towards consequentialism, where the end justifies the means. Yet another logical fallacy.
Okay, I don't insinuate that the Constitution is a living document. I flat out say it. You know why? Because I came to school that day when we talked about the Constitution in elementary school. And they told us how the Constitution works. And guess what? You can add amendments to the Constitution. There are ways to add amendments to the Constitution in the fucking Constitution. It's in the actual document. In fact, there's two ways to do it. Congress can do it, and the states can do it. Rocket Mr. E is not an American, so perhaps I should forgive him. But he's been so stupid on everything else that I just really don't. There are Americans who say this all the time, though. And I'm just like, were you absent that day at school? Because the Constitution is a living document. It was designed that way. You can't argue against that. There are ways to change the Constitution in the Constitution itself. If that wasn't true, there would not be ways to change it. So Rocket Mr. E is a consequentialist. He doesn't seem to know it, but he is. Now, he's a rule consequentialist, though. Ayn Rand's a rule consequentialist, so is John Stuart Mill. There's no other way to make his philosophy work. It has to be rule consequentialism. Because his whole justifying of the rights is consequentialist. When he says that you have a right to life because when you try to take that away from another person, you risk getting harmed by trying to take their life away, that's consequentialism. That's a consequentialist argument. Now, Ayn Rand, I argue she's a consequentialist. And there's much more wiggle room for her. Someone could argue she's a deontologist, but it's hard to make it work with that. My girlfriend was the one who escaped my attention because there's so much bullshit in this video. But when he says it's a logical fallacy, consequentialism, the end justifies the means, is a logical fallacy. It's not a logical fallacy. It's just another philosophical viewpoint. I disagree with that viewpoint. And what he's actually describing is utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism is not consequentialism. It's a form of consequentialism. And so I disagree with utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is where the greatest good for the greatest number of people is the right thing to do. And I'm against utilitarianism very much. Though I think it's an interesting moral theory to discuss on your way to trying to figure out morality. But he's a consequentialist. And in fact, I'm against consequentialism in all its forms. His version is consequentialism. In fact, Nozick tried to do a deontological libertarian view, and I just don't think deontological libertarian view works. It just doesn't work because it's too limited about what your rights are. It just doesn't work. I don't think any form of libertarianism works, actually, but a deontological version doesn't work because you're deriving these from rules. And if you're getting these rules from reason, Kant's version of rules that you can derive from reason is more inclusive, it's better, it makes more sense, it's more consistent. So why wouldn't you take that one?
Can individualists partake in democracy given that they uphold natural rights and negative liberty, and democracy is an inevitable push towards moral relativism? This is a question that divides individualists. Murray Rothbard believed that individualists can partake in the democratic process if it results in more individualism. Conversely, Stefan Molyneux feels that democracy is a distraction that leads to servitude. Personally, I'm inclined to agree with Murray Rothbard. To clarify my reasoning behind this, I'll refer to the UK Independent Party, otherwise known as UKIP. While I disagree with several of UKIP's policies, one of the reasons I would vote for them is because they want to get the UK out of the European Union. The UK leaving Europe would not only reduce the size and scope of government, but also push the pendulum closer towards individualism as a result. This is similar to the way that collectivists operate, only for the opposite goal of more collectivism.
See, this is where that problem with social contract theory comes up. If you're participating in the government, then um, you're implicitly signing the social contract theory. Just as if you use the roads, use the libraries, you take. There's people who are libertarians who take student loans. I went to a state university, and when I went back to school to study philosophy and religion about the same time that the 2008 presidential election occurred, so I was right back in school, and the Tea Party sprang up around that time, and I saw people who were going to a state university. One guy was in a wheelchair, and they were going to the Tea Party rally. You are implicitly socialists because you go to a state university, and that one guy's in a wheelchair. There's no way he doesn't take disability for something. There's no way. And they're going to a Tea Party rally. That's what just drives me freaking insane. That's a problem. And you can't change your government. If your government is democratic, you can't change your government by not voting. You can affect change from the outside. Protest and everything like that. But you need to vote too. You need to do both. Like leave no stone unturned. I actually agree with Rockin' Mystery on that. Because even though he adopts a philosophy which is anti-democratic, he still says you should vote. My philosophy isn't completely anti-democratic, but I would say yes, protest, give money to the causes that you want to endorse, but also vote. Like, why would you not vote? Voting is the easiest thing to do. It's easier than giving money to different causes. It's easier than protesting. It's definitely easier than protesting. That's actually the really hard part, is protesting, especially if you're afraid the cops are going to bust your head in, which is always happening to protesters. So, voting is the easiest thing you can do. Like guys like Russell Brand, who people thought he was brilliant when he gave that interview and he said that you shouldn't vote. It's like, you're an idiot. Vote. Take 5 minutes out of your day to vote. Like, honestly, it's the easiest thing you can do. Protest and do whatever else you want to do too. But voting's the easiest thing to do.
Unless individualists begin to realise that their apathy towards the democratic process makes collectivists stronger, then there's only one direction that the system will go: less individualism. Democracy is a fallacious appeal at its very core. Voting is not a rational or moral way to secure our individual freedoms, but unfortunately, this system is deeply rooted in the public conscience as a noble and virtuous ideal, and so lack of participation destroys your ability to have any say. It's equally unfortunate that many individualists feel that a collapse will allow a new age to emerge from the ashes.
I cut off the very end here because he kind of just goes on about a dark age and all that crap. It's not really relevant. Now, the main problem with Rockin' Mystery and the main problem with libertarians is they believe it's an all or nothing. The thing about, say, communism versus libertarianism, especially anarcho-capitalist libertarianism, they're actually two ideals that are taken to their extreme. But the idea that these ideals can't work together is kind of insane, because they work together all the time. Rights and democracy work together pretty well. In our culture, they work pretty well. Like in the U.S. culture and in the UK and most of continental Europe, tends to work just fine. Like countries like Iceland, Japan. Not that it doesn't have problems. I'm not going to say it doesn't have problems. That's why, when people say, we need to, sometimes in the U.S. you hear people say, we need to just scrap everything and start from the beginning. It's like, no, we don't. There's a movement to get a constitutional convention to have add an amendment to the Constitution that would make money not speech, which would do a lot. It would probably fix all our problems, actually. It's the biggest thing to do. There's a movement to do it. Like many states that we even consider conservative states, like red states, are behind it, like Montana. So once we get enough states to do that, we might have a new constitutional amendment, which we haven't had one forever. So it would be good, and it would really help the U.S. It'd really help us get money out of politics and make it more fair so corporations don't control our government. When I was an undergrad, I was taking a political science class, and the professor had an essay on every test, and she always graded it on a curve, so only one person could get the top score on the essay. And I actually got the top score on one of the 3 tests, which surprised me because it was the 3rd test, and the first 2 I didn't even get even close to the top score. And everyone was kind of jealous of the person who got the top score. I was really jealous of the people who got the top score in the first 2. But on the third one, I ended up getting the top score, which surprised me. But the essay question was about these dichotomies, like liberty versus equality, or all these other values that we value in the U.S. that seem to be contradictory. And she said the reason she gave me the top score was because I was the only person in the class who argued that they were compatible. She said everyone else either said, no, liberty trumps equality, or equality trumps liberty, or like something like that, whatever the values were. I think like rule of law and individualism were two of the other ones, but I don't remember what exactly they were. And I was not terribly bright when I was 19, I don't think. At least not compared to me now. Probably nobody thinks that when they look back at themselves as like a teenager, thinks that they're bright compared to themselves like in their late 20s or 30s. So it surprised me that I think I just got that right. I realized that right away because I believe almost nothing I believed when I was 19 now. And I think I got it right then. But like a lot of people don't seem to understand this. They don't seem to understand that things can be compatible. And I think they can be. You don't need to be like extreme, like have extreme views. You can, like, socialism is at its heart a moderate viewpoint. Not that the moderate viewpoint is always the correct viewpoint, but I just happen to think socialism is moderate where it's considered far left in the United States. Because we really are socialists in the United States for the most part. We really are. We're just like not as socialist as other countries. Anyway, the next episode of Rock and Mystery will be on abortion. So that'll be up really soon. I'm actually doing them both on the same day, but I'm going to post them at different times. So yeah, you will see that one pretty soon.